Okay, so our last symposium was on the somewhat self-interested topic of how we can get AI to do what we want. Now we're going to switch to the point of view of the AI itself and ask about the moral status of AI, and with questions of the sort of what the rights of AI are, how the moral status depends on cognitive abilities. Our first speaker is Matthew Liao. He's the Arthur Zitrin Professor of Bioethics at NYU, the director of the Center for Bioethics, the editor of the Journal of Moral Philosophy, and the founder of the Ethics, Etc. group blog. He's interested in a broad spectrum of philosophical issues centering on ethics, bioethics, and moral psychology, and his title is going to be Artificial Intelligence and Moral Status.
Thank you, Ned. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Okay, so a couple years ago when I shared an office, well, not shared an office, when I had my office next door to Nick Bostrom, we actually tried to write a paper on this topic on artificial intelligence and moral status, but we never got around to finishing it. So I'm really glad to have this opportunity to think more about this topic. So machines and artificial intelligence are acquiring more and more capacities. We have Deep Blue winning. Speak into the mic. Okay. We have Deep Blue winning the chess, winning in chess. Watson winning in Jeopardy and AlphaGo. They're also, some of them are acquiring mobility. They can move around. We have the Google self-driving cars. And efforts are underway to build machines that can recognize emotions, so the so-called affective intelligence. And the possibilities that AIs may acquire human level or even greater than human level intelligence is being seriously considered, indeed by many people in this room. As AIs gain more and more capacities, the issue of whether they will acquire greater moral status becomes salient. Moral status is the standing that an entity has that gives moral agents a potential reason to act towards it in a certain way. So for example, cats have a certain status in virtue of being sentient. Their moral status qua sentience gives moral agents at least a potential reason not to, a potential reason to act towards them in a certain way. So for example, not to cause them unnecessary pain. So what kind of moral status will AIs have as they gain greater and greater capacities? Will they one day have human level moral status? Will they have greater than human level moral status? To answer these questions, we need a theory of moral status. So I'm going to begin by sketching such a theory. So to start, here's a list of entities that could have or could have moral status. And it's not intended to be exhaustive. So we have inanimate objects, rocks, the environment, non-human terrestrial living things, plants, animals, bacteria, et cetera, normal functioning human beings with full physical, cognitive, emotional, and social capacities, so normal adult human beings, damaged human beings, the comatose, the severely mentally disabled, human beings at the beginning of life, so fetuses, infants, possible future human beings, future generations, non-living human beings, dead human beings, and we could also talk about aliens, you know, if they exist, and we're going to apply this to AI and robots. So how do we determine what kind of moral status each of these entities has? So here are some constraints. First, it seems that we need some kind of objective empirical method. And the reason is that there doesn't seem to be an a priori way of knowing what kind of moral status an entity has. So for example, if we were to meet some alien beings when we go to Mars, and we want to know what kind of moral status it has, it seems that we would not be able to know this a priori. to find out, it seems that we would at least have to investigate empirically what attribute it has and consider whether these attributes are normally salient, such that the alien should have a certain kind of moral status. A second constraint is something called the species neutrality requirement. So the idea here is that the criterion for moral status should not exclude any species in advance. An example of a criterion that would exclude other species in advance is being human. Being human would exclude all other human species. So being human doesn't satisfy the species neutrality criterion. A third constraint is that the empirical criterion should be based on the intrinsic properties of an entity. So this is kind of controversial, but most people think that it's based on the intrinsic properties of an entity. So the intrinsic properties of an entity are properties that are internal or inherent to an entity. The extrinsic properties of an entity are properties that depend on an entity's relationship with other entities. So for example, being a moral agent is an intrinsic property that a normal functioning adult human being typically would have. Whereas being a spouse would be an extrinsic property that depends on someone's being married to another person. So suppose that you and your spouse are both drowning. You would of course value your spouse more based on your relationship with her and try to save her first. But in one respect, your spouse and the stranger would still have the same moral status in virtue of the fact that they're both moral agents. Okay. So here's some criterion for moral status. Whether an entity is alive, whether an entity is conscious, whether it's sentient, whether it can feel pain, whether it can desire, whether it has the capacity to know something about the causality, such as if one does X, then Y would happen, and the capacity to bring about something intentionally, so rational capacity, and whether it has the capacity to understand and act in light of moral reasons, so moral agency. So next, it seems that some entities are going to have greater moral status than others. So for example, if you compare a rock with a plant, it seems that the plant would have greater moral status. And an obvious explanation is that the plant is alive, but the rock isn't. And among entities that are alive, arguably some will have greater moral status than others. So if you compare a plant and a turtle, it seems that the turtle would have greater moral status than the plant. And an explanation of that is that the turtle is sentient and the plant isn't. And finally, among entities that are sentient, arguably some will have even greater moral status than others. So take a normal functioning adult human being and an adult. It seems that the human being would have greater moral status than the turtle. And the explanation here is something like the human being has moral agency while the turtle doesn't. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So let me say something about the basis of human moral status. The kind of moral status that human beings have is often called right-holding. They're called right-holders. So the question we want to ask is, are all human beings right-holders? So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But it turns out that it's actually quite difficult to defend this claim. Philosophers who have examined it have tended to find themselves either agreeing that not all human beings are right-holders, or adopting what Peter Singer calls a speciesist position, where speciesism is defined as morally favoring a particular species, in this case human beings, over others without sufficient justification. So why is this? Well, the problem is that there doesn't seem to be a relevant empirical attribute that would apply to all human beings. So take actual sentience, for example. Some human beings, such as an encephalic infant or a comatose person, lacks actual sentience. Or take actual moral agency. Many human beings, including newborn infants, lack actual moral agency. These human beings will not be right-holders on these accounts of right-holding. And this is called the problem of marginal cases. So elsewhere, I've actually argued that we can have an account that doesn't have to be speciesist, And that appears to allow all human beings to be right holders. And what this account says is that a sufficient condition for an entity to be a right holder is if the entity has the genetic, or more generally, the physical basis for moral agency. Let me just very briefly sketch this account. So the physical basis for moral agency is the set of physical codes that generate moral agency. In human beings, this set of physical codes is located in their genome. And we know this because a lot of complexity is needed as the developmental basis for a complex adaptive phenotype like moral agency, and the genome contains a significant portion of this complexity. So to have the genetic basis for moral agency, the genes that make up moral agency must be activated and be coordinating with each other in an appropriate way. A being does not have the genetic basis for a certain attribute if it just possesses somewhere in its genome the genes for that, that could make up the attribute, but these genes are either not activated or are scrambled in such a way that they do not coordinate with each other appropriately. Let me just flesh that out. So suppose there's a book that contains many random words, which if put together would result in a Shakespeare book. This book would not be a Shakespeare book because it just contains the correct words. These words must be organized and be coordinated in the right kind of way. So I've argued that it can actually be shown that all human beings, including infants, the severely disabled, those in persistent vegetative state, and so on, have the genetic basis for moral agency. So given this, on my account, they would all be right holders. And this account avoids speciesism because if it turns out that gorillas and chimpanzees and other animals have the genetic basis for moral agency, or more generally, the physical basis for moral agency, they would also be right holders. And let me just add that this account is compatible with permissive views about abortion. So we can follow Judith Jarvis Thompson and say that even if a fetus is a right holder, a woman still has a right to determine what happens inside her body. That is, she has a right to bodily integrity. Okay. Let me just mention one other feature of this, this account. So there's this idea of the function of right holding, which says that if and when the right holder's interest is in conflict with the same kind of interest, that is, with the comparable interest of a non-right holder, the right holder's interest should prevail. So just to take an example, suppose that you have a choice between saving a turtle's limb and a human being's limb. The turtle's interest in keeping the limb and the human being's interest in keeping the limb appear to be comparable. The function of right holding says that you should save the human being's limb, which seems to be the correct verdict. Okay. So let us now consider what kind of moral status AIs can have. Is the AI alive? Is the AI conscious? Is the AI sentient? Can the AI feel pain? Can the AI desire? Does the AI have rational agency? Does the AI have moral agency? If an AI can acquire some or all of these capacities, it will gain the kind of moral status that accompanies each of these intrinsic properties. And I just realized that I printed my notes ran out. So I'm gonna have to freelance. So ran out of paper on my printer. Technology. Okay. So okay. So yes.
Could you hold the mic in your hand?
Yes. Okay. I can do that very easily. Yeah. Okay. Yes. More paper clips. That's right. So. So the idea, I mean, one of the issues that we're interested in finding out is whether AIs can have human-level moral status. So I think that there's a way for AIs to have human moral level status, and that is it's sufficient if an AI has the physical basis for moral agency. So that sort of comes out of my account of right holding. And again, that physical basis has to be active and be coordinating in the right way. So it's not enough that these physical codes are just sort of randomly strewn somewhere. It has to be activated and in the right kind of way. So then there's a further issue, which is whether AIs can have greater than human level moral status. And I think the answer to that question is sort of possibly. But I want to argue that if that's true, it's not going to be based on extending the current criteria that we have for moral status, such as rationality or moral agency. So let me explain why. So take here two people. So take rational agency, for example. So first, you got two people, right? You have a bright who's above average intelligence, say 150 IQ. Then you have average, average intelligence, say 100 IQ. It seems that even though bright is a lot brighter than average, we would say that they have equal moral status. They're both right holders. So if there's, say they're both are drowning, it seems that we would, maybe we should toss a coin. We wouldn't think that we necessarily have to save above average, right? And we wouldn't think that we would be doing something morally impermissible if we were to save average. Okay. Now, suppose you got somebody who's exceptionally bright. So this person has exceptional intelligence, 350 IQ. And then we still have the average here. Again, it seems that we wouldn't necessarily think that we should save exceptionally bright. Okay. And if that's the case, then if an AI is also exceptionally bright, say has 350 IQ, it doesn't seem like we would say that just because it's really smart, it has greater moral status. So it's not going to be, they're going to have the same kind of moral status, even though they have different, they differ in their levels of intelligence. What about moral agency? A lot of people, one of my accounts says that there's something really important about moral agency. So you might think, well, how about if someone is really moral? What if we amplify moral agency, the capacity for moral agency? Again, I don't think that it's going to change whether these two people are right holders, so or have different moral status. So take here, Joe has average moral agency, and Teresa has exceptional moral agency. Again, we wouldn't think that Teresa, we should always save Teresa and not Joe, and we would think that it would be impermissible to save Joe if say they were both in some sort of emergency situation. And so you can do the same thing. You can imagine AIs that are have exceptional moral agency, and we wouldn't again say that. It seems like we would say the same thing, that they have equal moral status. So the upshot of that is that if AIs, these AIs are going to have greater than human moral status, it's going to, and I'm not saying that that's not possible, it's going to have to come from somewhere else, like some other attribute, some other normatively salient attribute. Okay, so let me just finally conclude by talking about how we can get to artificial moral intelligence. This is talking about the future. I have stuff to say about self-driving cars as well. But I'm just here just only focusing on the future artificial moral intelligence. I think there are two ways to get there, through gradual substitution and through coding. So a lot of people have talked about gradual substitution, so I'm going to be very brief. So basically the idea here is that an individual's brain is replaced by an inorganic substitute gradually. So imagine that your brain, and you gradually replace it neuron by neuron with sort of an inorganic substitute. Now, assuming that consciousness is maintained, and this is a big assumption, there's a huge question about whether, when you substitute the neurons, whether at some point the consciousness might just disappear. But just, so I'm, making this big assumption that consciousness is maintained. Now there's a question, suppose that the resulting being survives, right? It seems that this would be an artificial moral, this would be an entity with artificial moral intelligence. So that's sort of one way by which we can get artificial moral intelligence. Here's another way of, but a lot of people are talking about coding artificial moral intelligence. And here I want to say, and they're talking about sort of, I think they're talking about, I think this is true whether it's top down or bottom up. right? They're talking about coding things, putting moral theories like consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics into these AIs. And I don't think that's going to work. I think that these principles and norms are too specific and too high level for us to try to code into AIs. Not the least because there are so many of them, and it seems like it's impossible to put in all the different rules, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to suggest a different alternative, and this is based on sort of some work in moral psychology on the universal moral grammar. So the idea here is that the mind may be equipped with a universal moral grammar that enables each of us in different cultures unconsciously and automatically to evaluate a limitless variety of actions and generate moral evaluations such as right and wrong. So this came from John Rawls and Mikhail, drawing on Chomsky's work. So the way the moral faculty works is that it has domain general cognitive mechanisms generating representations of actions based on variables such as agent, intention, belief, action, receiver, consequence, and moral evaluation. And then some cognitive mechanisms, for example, the moral faculty, then combine these representations to generate moral judgments such as impermissible, permissible, and obligatory. I just published a book called The Moral Brains that has a lot, discusses a lot of these topics, so in case you want to look at it. Okay, so the idea here is that maybe we can draw on the universal moral grammar to have some sort of artificial moral grammar. So what we need are codes that would represent various variables over there, and then combine these representations to generate moral judgments, okay? And one other thing is that I think that genuine artificial moral intelligence are going to need to understand why a certain action is the morally right or wrong action. That is, they're gonna, the way we tell whether we've succeeded is whether they can understand whether an action is right or wrong. It's not gonna be enough that they know a bunch of moral propositions. And so I think the holy grail of artificial moral intelligence is gonna be moral understanding. So just to wrap up, I think AIs can achieve human level moral status when they have the physical basis for moral agency. To have greater than human level moral status, AI needs to acquire some other normatively salient capacity besides rational agency and moral agency. And a genuine artificial moral intelligence will have the capacity for moral understanding. Thank you.
So with your presentation you just gave us, it seems like that you dwelt on a lot of different terminology that you've defined in the first half of your presentation, particularly moral agency. I was a little confused about one of the examples you gave us, and even though this is a very sensitive issue to a lot of people, I hope you can deal with the terminology in particular. According to your claims, an unborn child has the genetic or physical basis to have a moral agency because an unborn child has its own genetic code. How then do you rationalize abortion? Does a woman's right to bodily integrity supersede an unborn child's moral status?
Yeah, I think it does. So I think I cover that. So they have the right to bodily integrity. And elsewhere, I have a whole discussion about sort of a human right. So I think bodily integrity is a fundamental condition for pursuing the basic activities. And so, so they have a right to that. And that's why,
Hi, I'm Bruce Costa from Granite Forest Sangha, and I noticed you had stated somewhat axiomatically about the differentiation we would make if someone were drowning, and maybe I'm alone in the room, but I struggle with that as an axiom that we wouldn't say save Mother Teresa before the boy, or perhaps
Good.
allow Adolf Hitler to drown before the boy, right? So I wonder if you could just kind of speak a little more on that, and if you would like, say what you were going to say about automated cars.
I think I will talk about that because I'll take another talk. But I will say that, so Hitler or something like that, I mean, if someone does something morally wrong, there are sort of different theories about desserts, and that's sort of, you can sort of think that the claim is an other things being equal claim. So other things being equal, if you're talking about two strangers, seems like you should, you should flip a coin. And if one is just smarter, so if two patients go into the sort of emergency room, you wouldn't say, hey, let's see, this one is smarter, let's save this one first. Like that would, it seems like that would be totally wrong, right? And so, but there are disagreements about that. I mean, some, if you're a consequentialist, you might think, oh no, if we could tell, then we really should save the smarter person. I disagree with that, but I agree with you that there is an issue there. So, yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. That was great. I just wanted to ask you, you said at some point that you thought the method for figuring out moral status would have to be empirical. And the reason you gave is that you'd have to empirically figure out what attributes a particular organism or creature has.
Yeah.
But of course, there's the question what attributes they have, and then the question of what the moral relevance of those attributes is, given that they have those attributes.
Right.
And it seems to me that last bit has to be a priori, or at least I don't know if any
That's right.
a posteriori ways of doing that.
That's right.
Did you mean to include both?
Yeah, I meant to include both. I just sort of, so it partly has to be empirical. It's a partly empirical inquiry where you at least have to look at, what attributes they have. That's an empirical question.
But
you
the conditional, the conditional, if they have these attributes, then they have moral status. That's presumably a priori.
That's right. That's right. You need to have a normative premise, and that normative premise is a priori. Thank you, Paul, for clarifying that for me. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk.
Yeah.
So if you're taking the analogy between language and morality, what roadblocks do you think we'll face trying to program in a universal moral grammar that would be analogous to programming in language?
I don't know. So I wish Stephen Wolfram was here. He can sort of answer that question. But I think that, is he? Oh, maybe he wants to answer it. So I'm relying on people like Stephen to solve that problem for me. But the basic, the general idea is that we need to operate at a much lower level. This whole level about value alignment, et cetera, maximization, seems like that's already, there's too many, it's too theory laden, there are too many things. Sort of the basic, they're sort of, before any of that, they're sort of, so this is not even a bottom-up approach, this is sort of pre-bottom-up approach, in a sense that this moral faculty is just sort of, it's the way we view the world and we see moral properties and moral values, things like harm, persons, et cetera, and then some sort of mechanism for being able to combine those different things and weight them, right? And so we need, seems like that's the way to go. And then it's a further issue how these artificial moral agents, how they're going to make decisions. Maybe they'll make better decisions than we will because they'll have more information. Maybe they'll make worse, et cetera. That's an open question, and I don't say anything about that. But just see, in terms of one of the things I do want to say is that for AI researchers in the room, it seems like that could be explored. That could be fruitfully explored. Thanks.
All right, so I was just thinking, because you put a lot of emphasis on like the material basis, and it seemed peculiar to me. I mean, like humans from a few hundred years ago clearly don't have the moral development that we have, even though they have practically the same DNA.
Yeah.
And you might have beings that have such bizarre forms, or you might have virtual entities, right, that like don't have DNA at all, or a way to assess but yet they might be extremely sophisticated.
Thank you. I agree. That's why the account more generally is the physical basis for moral agency, and that's why it can accommodate artificial intelligence. So it just so happens that all the living things that we know have the have genetic base, genetic codes, but that might change in the future. And if that were to be the case, then these other entities could also have moral agency.
So,
Yeah.
thanks very much. I wonder if it might be useful to distinguish between something like moral standing and value. So, moral standing, you might say, gets you into the category of being a rights holder. And then you might say, no matter what your intelligence or other kind of value would be, that you should have rights just like all the other rights holders. But I don't know if we want to say that rights holders always have precedence. So even a deontologist is probably willing to say there are some times when sacrificing a small human interest, if it would indeed reduce the suffering of animals, let's say, in a very substantial way, that would be a morally good thing. And so even a deontologist isn't committed to the idea that we have only one notion in play here, standing, and that it's got to be graduated in the way you suggest. We might have it as a qualification for certain kinds of moral consideration, holding responsible, things like that. But we don't want that to, so to speak, be a bar against considering against human interests or against even human claims that would be based on some kind of freedom of movement or action, completely ignore the disvalue that we could cause to other species.
That sounds absolutely right. So that's why when I defined moral status, I talked about portental consideration. So it's one reason, sort of other things being equal. Right. So and then the other thing I say is that when I talk about the function of right holding, I said that it has to be comparable interests. So if it's like one tiny interest of yours, but really, you know, if your tea is going to get cold and then there's a cat who's, you know, being run over by a car, it seems like you should go save the cat, right? Because the interests are not comparable. So I totally agree there. So it doesn't have lexical priority. It doesn't sort of trump.
So there won't be a general principle that right holders have precedence.
It's a protanto when the interests are comparable. Just sort of there's a reason, a sort of prima facie reason. There's sort of a sort of I don't know. I'm just using it. Yeah, sort of. There's it's not an all things considered reason, right? So, yeah.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you're arguing that whether an entity is a right holder can be understood by its potential as a moral agent, right? And so is the AI itself not a moral agent and therefore a right holder on equal footing with a living, otherwise what we understand to be a living being, and therefore also with the second point that you made about a person of average moral intelligence not being on equal footing with someone of exceptional moral intelligence. So you could have an AI of low moral intelligence that has an equal moral status to an exceptionally moral living human.
I'm not sure if I quite follow that, but I think that so what I wanted to say was that sorry, can you just
is the AI not a moral agent? And,
yes.
And
okay.
by your definition, then
no,
a
AIs
right
could,
holder on the same footing as a
Yeah.
human being.
Good. So the AIs could be moral agents if they have the physical basis for moral agency. So there's nothing that bars them from having moral agency. In terms of the degree, I think that I think that there's some sort of hierarchy of moral status. So I think that moral agency may be more. This is something that hasn't been developed, but I'm inclined to think that moral agency has value over rational agency. So I'm imagining there's you. And then there's a really smart paperclip making being, right? And which one should I save? It seems like I should save you rather than this super intelligent paperclip making being. And if that's the case, it seems like moral agency has some sort of value overriding rational agency. But that's controversial. So,
wait, can I ask one question? It's really quick.